Welcome to the Innovation Ecosystem Podcast. We interview remarkable and thought-provoking guests about innovation, leadership, and change in the world of business. Whether you're an executive or an entrepreneur, our objective is to help you and your organization create an entrepreneurial culture, become more innovative, and better able to respond to change. Each week, we'll deconstruct world-class performance from the arenas of business, academia, science, and sports. Each week, you can expect key insights, fresh perspectives, and proven tools you can use straight away to make you more successful professionally and personally. With your hosts, Mark Bidwell and Roddy Miller.
Hello, I'm Roddy Miller, your co-host on the Innovation Ecosystem podcasts. In our first show, my co-host, Mark Bidwell, was in conversation with the fabulous futurist and thinker on innovation, Lisa Bodell. Please do hop over to our website, www.innovationecosystem.net, to take a listen. Today, in this my first show of the series, I'm thrilled to be in conversation with Steve Goldstein, former CEO of American Express Bank. Steve previously held senior positions at Sears and Citigroup, and today advises large organizations around the globe and sits on the board of several private equity businesses, both in the US and Europe. So he's amazing access to loads of different businesses, and we gain from those insights now. Later this year, Steve will publish his book, Why the Snowblowers in Miami? Transform Your Business Using the 5 Principles of Engagement. However, you don't have to wait until September when the book is published, as Steve entertainingly tells us the answer in this story and others in our conversation. So I'm delighted to have him here today to discuss that and some of his many insights into leadership and creating good organizational culture. Steve, it's great to be with you.
Great to be with you this morning, Roddy.
You've had lots of big corporate experience at a high level in your career, as we've just covered. What made you want to break free from that and write a book?
Well, I broke free quite a while ago. I had, as you said, a lot of large company, big experience. And then I went sort of to the other end and got involved in venture capital businesses, startups and smaller companies that were in need of money and management assistance, and then moved into the private equity arena where I now am. And I've always had this itch to write a book, and it never seemed the right time to do it. But about 2 years ago, after speaking with a lot of people, they said, you seem to have some really good ideas about what works and what doesn't work, and you should write your book. And after I heard enough people telling me, who were not relatives, by the way, that I should do this, I decided that I was going to commit to writing the book. So about a year and a half ago, I really sat down in earnest to write the book.
Okay. And is it drawing mainly from your experiences as an investor in private equity, or is there a heavy focus on your experience from being in American Express and other large organizations?
I think it's a bit of both. I've been very fortunate that I've had a number of very diverse experiences in terms of large companies and small companies, growth situations, turnaround and troubled situations, startups, and that's given me a number of different perspectives of how to look at things. I decided that if I was going to write a book, I read a lot of business books, as I'm sure you do, and I find most of them to be pretty flat and sort of boring, at least to me. They're full of charts and graphs and case studies and tend to be a bit theoretical. And I decided that if I were going to write a book, I wanted it to be a little bit more like me, so to have some humor and sarcasm in it, to have real hard-hitting stories that actually happened. And I realized that I didn't want the book to be about me. I wanted it to be more generalizable. So the book is a compendium of stories. As you know, stories are, since the history of man, have been the best way to communicate, at least generationally, from one to the other. And I think when people hear stories, the impact of what they take away might be more compelling. So the book is basically a combination of my stories, and I've also interviewed, I think, 16 CEOs, both from the for-profit and not-for-profit arena. And I think the collection of their stories plus my stories, sort of interwoven with these 5 principles of engagement that I'm sure we'll talk about on this chat, sort of creates a quilt, if you will, of my view as to what it takes to be an effective leader and run a strong and results-oriented organization.
Sure. I mean, I think that storytelling aspect is critical in leadership as well. Leadership is to a large extent around learning and getting messages across to people. So communication too, and storytelling is a really neat package way of transferring those messages. I mean, is that something that you've used anyway in your leadership roles?
Yes, I mean, I think, I've been told by friends and others that I'm a really good storyteller. I don't know that I have a lot of other skills, but apparently I'm a very good storyteller. And, I find that, whether I'm dealing with friends or family or business situations, that it's really helpful to tell a story. And the story doesn't have to be long. It could be short. But I think people take away the essence of the story in a way that they can take the concept you're trying to teach them, take it on board more fully, and less a matter of sort of rote memorization than really understanding the essence of what the message is. And I know that that's the way I learn. And I think most people, if given a choice, would rather have another, a method of teaching and learning that has greater stickiness. And the way you get stickiness is you really have to get it. And so one of the things that I'm really happy about with the book is, because I've shown some chapters to certain people, and the reaction I get is, not only have I seen this movie, I've actually been in this movie. And, that helps them realize in some cases the craziness of a situation and the fact that you could be blind to the situation, but you have to find a way to get out from under your own comfort zone, if you will, sure. and try to see some things that, people describe things as looking around the corner, under the table. It's more important to see what's not right in front of you than it is to see what is, staring you, right in front of your face. Well,
hidden in plain sight often as well.
Hidden in plain sight, exactly.
Yeah, and stories are a great way of revealing things. But I'm interested about the leaders' use of stories. I mean, are they something that you actively practiced, or I mean, it sounds to me like you're a natural storyteller anyway, from what you're saying. So it probably comes easily. But do you think do you have a sort of repertoire of stories that you draw on for different occasions, or is it just they occur to you at the right moment?
They occur to me at the right moment. I was just in a meeting earlier this week, and there was an issue in the company about people not being forthcoming. And, there was a question of, is there a culture of fear of retribution? Is it a culture where people are not encouraged to speak up? And I'm not even talking about whistleblower, types of things. I mean, just, calling it for what it is.
Sure.
And I use the current example of Volkswagen, which is obviously, been in the news for the last 60 to 90 days. And, it's very clear, and, the story is coming out drip by drip, but it's very clear that they made a decision to promote and grow diesels, both in the United States as well as in other markets, as their primary engine of growth, no pun intended. But when they did that, they didn't have the technology to do that. And so they made all these commitments. They built, they spent a fortune in R&D. And the truth of the matter is, as it's coming out, they did not have a commercially viable technology to achieve the emission standards that they needed to make the product claims they were going to market, or they did market. And they're focusing on who knew and when did they know and who told whom. But the reality is that there was so much pressure on people to make these deadlines that you can imagine how impossible it would have been for someone to raise his hand for fear.
Yeah.
And so, the question, how far up the line did it go? And, who knows? And, there'll be investigations going on for years, and this is going to cost, VW, tens of billions of dollars, both in real money and sort of reputational risk and other things. And so I use this story to describe in a very graphic way, here's what happens when you get it wrong. This is a real consequence of not creating an environment where people are comfortable throwing a flag on the field to say there's a foul.
Absolutely.
And right. And so, that's an example of, so that's not my story. That's just a story. I frankly don't know where these stories come from. They sort of just come. Some of them come from my own experience, obviously. Some of them are happening real time in the news. Some of them I've been told by others. I'm a very keen observer of people. So when I look at people's eyes and I see, are they really getting it? Are they listening? You can see the lights going on. You could see their brains, the inside of their brains turning, really trying to digest what you're trying to communicate. And then they have a decision to make, do I understand it? And then do I agree with it? And then am I going to act accordingly? And it's sort of a progression like that, but I think you can't get to the last step unless you get the prior steps really ingrained and understood.
And that's that bit about connecting and creating engagement, isn't it?
Correct. Exactly.
It's interesting, but I just want to dig a little deeper on the VW story, and it's changing day by day at the moment. I mean, I think VW announced earlier in the week that it was less prolific, less widespread than it had been originally anticipated. But the story, as you say, continues to unfold. But what you're saying there, and this is the wider message, is it's really a culture issue,
yes,
and that is directed by people at the top of the organization, presumably.
Absolutely. And I think to make your to take your point a step further, everything in a company starts at the top, good and bad, and people follow leaders, and so they look to see what their leaders do, not what they say. And I can't tell you how many companies I've gone into where I've worked, where I've consulted, where I've advised, and I'm talking everywhere in the world, where you walk into the headquarters and somewhere in the central hallway or the lobby is, for want of a better term, our values, our mission statement. And it's a series of 8 to 10 bullet points about how we treat our customers, how we treat our people, how we treat each other. And, it brings tears to your eyes how wonderful these things are. And when you speak to employees, and one of the things I always do when I go into companies is I speak to employees at the lowest levels in the organization because they actually know what's going on. And it's not uncommon for one of these folks to say to me, what really pisses me off is I see these values every day when I walk into work and nobody practices them. Mm-hmm. Why do they even put this on the wall? And it actually has the unintended consequence of engendering the exact opposite reaction that the sign is supposed to create. And it's because it's only words. It's not what people are actually doing or how they're behaving.
So you've had senior positions, as we said, in large organizations.
Right.
And that inevitably brings an enormous amount of work. It's hugely stressful. There's presumably lots of firefighting going on
Right.
because large organizations bring up their own challenges the whole time. But how much were you personally, and do you think others, your peer group of people at that kind of level, think of themselves as leaders and therefore needing to project those kinds of values? Do you have the time to do that, or is it you're too busy getting the job done to have that sort of external self-awareness of yourself?
That is a great question, and it's several questions. I think people, and I'll tell you a story in a second, I think people in those positions think of themselves as, I'm an executive vice president, or I'm a senior vice president, or I'm a division president, or I'm a CFO. And that's my job. And I have a set of responsibilities and accountabilities I have to do. I don't know that they think of themselves as leaders. And it's funny that many companies don't refer to their people as leaders. GE does. They really stress leadership. They call their executives leaders. They don't call them executives. But many companies don't do that. They call them, this is our team, this is our executive team. And I think at some level, these people really think of themselves more as executives than they do as leaders. And I think it's not just a semantic difference. That's number one. Number two is, and I talk about this a lot in the book, it is always the case. That's too broad. It is often the case that people use lack of time as a way to explain why they're not doing a lot of different things, ranging from I don't have time to take a vacation to I don't have time to do this to I don't have time to do that.
Yeah.
And the reality is these guys are really busy. I mean, make no mistake. These guys, it's like my uncle used to say, you're working half a day from 8 to 8. A lot of these guys, that was my first indoctrination to business. I thought a half a day was a half a day. He meant it's 12 hours out of 24. That was sort of a rude awakening for me. But
it's a baptism of fire, that one.
A baptism of fire, exactly. But I mean, if you've got a big job in a big company, you're working 70, 80 plus hours a week, including the weekend. So to the outside it might seem glamorous, but on the inside it's a grind. I mean, it's hard work, and so there are a lot of pulls and tugs on you. There are a lot of demands on you, and time is probably one of the most precious commodities we have. And unfortunately, in large organizations, time just gets wasted for so many things. In fact, I have a chapter in the book about meetings and how meetings really have gotten out of control and take up so much time from leaders' days and accomplish so little. I mean, it would be one thing if there was some value add coming out of most of these meetings, but it's sort of the more time you spend in meetings, the less gets accomplished. And so, I've got some approaches on how to, change the whole meeting model. But I think the problem is that at the core of your question is I don't believe that a lot of leaders assume it's their responsibility to lead their organization, as opposed to just manage it through a set of requirements to let's hit our year-end target, let's make budget, let's achieve this goal, which tend to be more static metrics. They don't have to do with the way the organization runs as much as it is how they need to accomplish specific end results. And of course, you're in business to generate results, but my contention is how you get those results makes a huge difference as to whether they're sustainable and repeatable over time, as opposed to, just, working your butt off just to satisfy this requirement, and then you're out of gas. Then there's nothing left in the tank for you to do the next thing. But of course, tomorrow morning there's a whole new set of things you have to do. So it's sort of like getting fit and being in shape. I mean, you have to sort of run at a sprint pace for a marathon distance.
But I mean, you've seen. I mean, you've obviously worked in large organizations, and in your sort of private equity career, you've seen lots of organizations. How many put metrics around that leadership culture emphasis? Because we know that what gets measured gets done.
Right.
And if that's the output you're being benchmarked against, that's what you're going to drive for, and that's presumably takes us back to the VW story. That's presumably what was happening there.
Yes, and I think increasingly more companies. I mean, it goes by different names and labels, but more companies are doing what is commonly called 360 reviews, where you're reviewed not only by your boss, but you're reviewed by your colleagues at your peer group, and you're reviewed by your subordinates. And getting the feedback from those different constituencies can provide a picture as to what you're doing well and what you don't do so well. So, for instance, some people are very good at managing up, right? And so their boss thinks they're doing a great job, but they may have very sharp elbows dealing with their colleagues, and they may be brutal with their subordinates. Mm-hmm. So in that context, this 360 review, 3/4 of the review wouldn't be so great. Now, the question is, so you get those metrics. That's the easy part. The hard part is, what do you do with them? What's the actionability of those results? To what degree does the leadership of the company hold accountable the leaders who have been reviewed to make real, meaningful changes to their behaviors so that the next time the review is done, there's significant improvement? And that is where I think the process tends to fall down, that it becomes more of a box-checking exercise than one which creates, here's a program, here's Roddy's plan for next year, right? He's got to do these 3 things with his colleagues, he's got to do these 4 things with his subordinates, and he's got to do these 2 things with his boss. And he's got to take this seriously, and we expect next year when we score this again, there'll be improvement. And if there's not, what happens? What are the consequences of that? And unfortunately, what happens in many cases, if you hit your financial targets, that tends to be the holy grail. So, so you may not have done such a great job on your 360 follow-ups, but if you beat your targets, you probably got a pretty nice bonus.
That's still good enough.
Well, and it gives you a very, in the best of cases, it gives you a mixed message, because on the one hand, I've told you, I want you to work on this stuff, and let's say you didn't, but you really crushed your financial results, and I give you a fantastic bonus. What I'm basically telling you without telling you is just keep hitting your numbers, and the rest of this stuff I'm not really that worried about. You don't say that, of course, but that's effectively what it means, right?
And so what is the solution to that? Because it's going to be pretty difficult for a superior, a boss, to turn around and say, you've met all your numbers, but what can he do to change that behavior that has some power over them?
It's both simple and hard, but it starts with the leader, and it's incumbent on the leader to decide that he wants to. Let's take this as an example. He wants to take this seriously. So let's say in the example we just discussed, you've got serious issues with your 360 feedback from last year, and you beat your numbers better than anybody else, and you're due to get a whopping bonus. What I have done is I've said, okay, Frank, you should have gotten a bonus of X. I was actually going to give you 1.5X because you absolutely just crushed the numbers, but I'm going to give you 0.7X. I'm basically cutting it in half of what I would have given you for one reason. You did not address these leadership issues.
So you crushed the numbers, but you've crushed your team as well.
You've crushed your numbers and you've crushed your team. And next year I expect you to not only hit your numbers, but I expect these scores to go up. And I'm going to be, talking to your folks and I'm not going to wait till the end of the year to see what the survey says. I'm going to talk to your people and see how it's going. And not in a threatening way. You'll even be more successful if you do that. You'll have even better results. And, and he's going to look at you like you're crazy, and you're going to have a difficult conversation. And then he has a decision to make. He has to decide, are you really serious? And if he wants to stay with the company and continue to grow, he's going to have to get on board. Change his behavior. And, by the way, his behavior affects, hundreds and thousands of people below him. So there's a leverage factor here that works both ways. If he doesn't get it, neither does everybody else. And if he does get it, so does everybody else. So I think that, yeah, exactly. And so as I was writing this book, I said to myself, is this too simplistic? Because I've come up with these 5 principles and I've come up with all these prescriptive things to do. And I said, is it that simple? And I concluded it's that simple, but that's why it's so difficult. It's not rocket science.
Not rocket science. But have you've done this though? Have you? You've seen it in action, and it presumably does.
Absolutely.
It sends a really loud message, doesn't it? Because to an extent, it's unexpected. It's not traditional behavior. It's not how people think they're going to be treated, and so it really reinforces that message around the culture part, the leadership part, and that's ultimately what sustains organizations in the long term.
It's really funny. I was living in London quite a while ago with American Express, and I was brought in to basically turn around our business there. And I was there for about 3 or 4 days, and I'm sitting in this is before, PCs and everything. I'm dating myself, but this is before PC. So I'm actually looking through a pile of letters, mail, and I felt the presence in the office, and I looked up, and it was the window washer, with blue overalls, with his suspender untucked, with the newspaper, tucked in, with a cigarette or a fag in his mouth hanging down, and he startled me because it was like 7:30 in the morning. I thought. So I looked up and I saw him. I said, "Oh, hey, how you doing?" And he said, "Okay." And I said, "My name's Steve. What's your name?" He goes, "John." And I said, "Oh, you're the window washer?" He goes, "Yeah." So I said, "How long have you been doing this?" He goes, "About 25 years." So then he says to me, and the guy is totally in shock. Yeah, I could see it by his face. He's in shock because no one talks to him. So he says to me, "You the new..." Yeah, exactly. He says, "You the new governor?" And I said, "Yeah, I guess I'm the new governor." He goes, "No, governor." I said, "Okay, I'm the new governor." Yeah. He said, "What happened to the old governor?" I said, "He's gone." He goes, "Well, that's good." And I said, "Why is it good?" He says, "He was a bad man." And I said, "Well, what do you mean he was a bad man?" So he starts talking, and I said, "Hey, I'm going to get a cup of coffee. Would you like to join me for a cup of coffee?" And so this guy was in complete shock. So we walked over to the kitchen area. There's nobody else in the office, by the way, because they all came in like at 9:30 or 10. We walked to the kitchen area. We make 2 cups of coffee. We walked back. We're sitting at my table. And for the next 45 minutes, we're having this amazing conversation where he's telling me essentially that he's critiquing my leadership team by name. And I said, like, how do you know this? And he said, every other day I'm in their office. I'm washing the windows. You know, I hear how they talk on the phone. I hear how they talk to people. I hear how they talk to their wife or their girlfriend. You know, and he points to his head and he says, I got a picture of all of how they work. And by the way, this guy didn't go beyond the third grade, but he had such an innate sense of, you know, right and wrong, good and bad. And he had his own terminology. It obviously wasn't, you know, business terms and everything. So he looks at his watch and he says, "Oh, sorry, I have to get back to washing the windows or I'm going to be fired." I said, "No," and I said, "Yes, I don't want you to get fired, and I got a lot of work to do too. Would you be willing to have coffee with me every couple of months to just, you know, stay?" He says, "Absolutely." So he leaves, and we start meeting. And, you know, occasionally he would, you know, take me to his pub, his special pub. We'd have a couple of pints. And my guys, who were all, you know, basically Oxbridge graduates, wanted to know why this crazy American was having coffee, going to the pub with the window washer. And one day, one of them had the guts to ask me, and we were in a meeting. He said, you know, "With all due respect, sir, why are you spending your time with him?" And I looked at this fellow and I said, "You know what? I learned more from him than I've learned from all of you, because he actually knows." And I said, "You should talk to him." And they looked at me like we would never talk to him. And, you know, I invited him to the Christmas party, and because to me, he was a person first who happened to be a window washer. He was not a piece of furniture as he thought of himself to be. And, you know, that was like in the late 80s. And I as I'm telling you this story, it's like I'm seeing his face. That's how vivid it is. And it's that kind of thing that really, to me, is an indication of the degree to which you're committed to lead. It doesn't mean you have to go meet with the window washer,
sure,
but it means you have to get out of your cocoon. You've got to get out of the fancy office. You've got to go talk to people. I met a guy.
I think it's a fantastic story, but it's getting right under the skin of the organization, isn't it? And
exactly.
And there is this real problem for people high up in organizations that, you know, the bad news gets massaged and filtered out as it travels up through the organization.
Exactly.
So I think being able to find that conduit down to the, you know, the base level of where things are actually happening, the front line, is fundamentally important. And I imagine it's really difficult for leaders to do. You know.
I think it is. I think you know, and part of it is, you know, some people are, because I've given this a lot of thought in terms of why don't people do this, and I think one argument could be made that some people are naturally extroverted and some people are naturally introverted, and so obviously it's more difficult for someone who's, you know, shy, insecure, introverted to go out and approach people. You know, so I get that part. I think there's another piece of it that people believe that if I'm a senior person, I'm better than you. I don't need to deal with you. I don't think it's malicious, but it's almost like the caste system in India, you know, where you don't marry out of your caste because you don't want your family to be insulted. So I think part of it is that. I think part of it is you are afraid what you might find out, because if you do this and you find out bad stuff, like if the VW guys found out about this 5 years ago, then they would have had to put the brakes on the program, face a huge embarrassment, figure out what to do. But that would have been an easier problem. That would have just been a financial problem to deal with. It wouldn't have been a customer or legal or regulatory or reputational problem. It would have just been a money problem. But I'm not minimizing the fact that the money problem wouldn't be a problem. But that would be inherently more manageable than what we now.
Well, they've got a money problem now as well, though, haven't they? So.
Well, they got a money problem plus all the other ones. So arguably, it's a heck of a lot worse, right? So I think that there are lots of reasons or excuses why people don't do this. What I have found is that when I've encouraged people to do this and to do it in baby steps, just like you sort of have to learn everything else that you've never done before. Yep. And once you see it works, then, of course, you're going to do more of it. And then you realize it's actually a good use of your time. It's not a waste of time. Because if you come away with something after spending 45 minutes with somebody that you could never have figured out yourself, you're way ahead of the game.
Yeah.
It's very leverageable.
That plays beautifully to the first of your 5 points in your book, doesn't it? The fresh eyes one, which really appeals to me as a publisher of information. Bringing in new concepts and getting people to look at things through different lenses and different perspectives seems like a valuable thing to do. But you're very, very specifically sort of highlighting that.
Yeah, and the way this hit me most profoundly is when I was at Sears, which is based in Chicago, and it was a terrible winter with snowstorms and everything. I had to go give a speech.
They're always terrible winters in Chicago, aren't they?
Yeah, it's always terrible winters in Chicago. Exactly. That's not a unique thing for any particular. But this was particularly bad.
Right.
And I had to go give a speech in February in Miami to some group, and I always made it a point when I visited a city to go into the local Sears stores just to see what was going on, talk to people, see what was working, what wasn't working. And in any event, I go into the store, a few blocks away from where I had to give this speech, and I walked into the garden center. And mind you, this is Miami in February. It's like 86 degrees outside. And I see what you'd expect in a garden center: lawnmowers, patio furniture, barbecue grills, shovels, rakes, wheelbarrows, all that stuff, right? And then at the corner of my eye, I see 4 snowblowers. And I think I'm like hallucinating. So I walk over there, and I see that there actually are snowblowers. And I asked the salesman, who was an older gentleman who looked like he was about to retire. I said, hi, my name is Pete. I said, hey, Pete, what's the deal with the snowblowers? And he said, well, they ship them to us every year. We don't sell any. We ship them back in April. And then they come again in October. And I said, well, does anybody do anything? And he said, my boss calls the head office. His boss calls the head office. But it doesn't work because we keep getting them. I said, well, what do they tell you? And he says, well, it's part of the national allocation. And I said, do you know what that means? He goes, I have no idea what that means. All I know is we keep getting them. And I said, did you ever sell one? He said, we sold one. A couple of years ago, a couple was going to visit their children in Minneapolis. They bought one, they put it in their minivan, and they drove up to Minneapolis to give it to them for Christmas. I said, that's it? He goes, that's it. So we were in the middle of a terrible storm, and I had to go back 2 days later or a day later, and we had our weekly executive leadership meeting. And, of course, the topic of the day was this incredible snowstorm, what it's doing to the supply chain and distribution system. Everything's screwed up. And the biggest problem is we're out of stock in snowblowers, and we have them, but they're stuck in a warehouse somewhere in Minnesota or something. And everybody's like figuring out, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And I go, I know where there are 4. Here's this guy, Pete's business card. Call him in Miami, and at least you have 4. And they look at me, and they start laughing. And I said, why is this funny? And they said, no, it's funny that they're in Florida. I said, oh, it's actually not funny that they're in Florida. How could there be snowblowers in Florida? It never snows there. So anyway, the meeting ends. That's it. So I walk back to my office and I say to my assistant, stop what you're doing. I want you to find out. I want you to call anybody you can call. I want to know, since the history of recorded weather, how many times has it snowed in Miami? Don't do anything else. And she comes back and she says to me in about 45 minutes, it snowed once 7 years ago, 1/3 of an inch. I said, thank you. So I went back to the guy who was the big shot, the hard goods guy, who was the loudest laugher. And I said, okay, here's this. And obviously, there was a big problem that nobody was consciously deciding. They were just basically sending inventory, 5 to you, 3 to you, 10 to you, with no care or tracking as to whether it made sense. And this was going on forever. And my concern was, what other products and SKUs were they doing this with? But the problem, I walked in with fresh eyes because I was shocked. The problem is, the people who worked in the store, they stopped seeing the snow. Pete stopped seeing the snowblowers, right? Because they were just there because it was utter futility, right? And his managers gave up. The senior leadership from the merchandising departments probably never were in the stores, and if they did see them, they obviously didn't do anything about them. And so this notion of fresh eyes really is really critical, because it really is a sort of outside-in perspective as opposed to an inside-out perspective, and it's fresh. It looks at things, as they are or as they should be, not necessarily as they appear, where all the allowances and justifications for why something is not right have become accepted.
Yeah, but I mean, it's difficult to bring fresh eyes to something in your normal environment. I mean, you are outside of your normal environment. Is there a trick to trying to look at your the world around you as you're familiar with it through fresh eyes, or does it require you to break out and go to different places and have other people come to your environment to do that?
I think it's both. I think you have to step out and see things yourself. I also think, as a leader, if you meet with individual or groups of employees and ask them questions like, how's it going, what's working, what's not working, they know. They will tell you. And not only will they tell you, in many cases, they'll tell you what needs to be done to fix it. But of course, if you don't ask them, if they don't believe that you value them or value their opinions, this notion of putting things in a suggestion box, that doesn't work. I mean, you really have to roll up your sleeves and, sit elbow to elbow or shoulder to shoulder with these folks. Mm-hmm. And they need to believe that you're serious and you're committed, which means if you do this, you have to be willing to follow up with some actions. But again, once they realize you're serious, then they'll start contacting you and saying, hey, I just noticed this doesn't seem right. Can you address it? Then you've begun to empower, many people in the organization who actually do want it to be. Nobody really wanted those snowblowers to be there, but they were there.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's I mean, so that goes back to creating culture again, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
And I'm just sort of interested around how you can foster this sort of culture of innovation, and a lot of it, I think, is around that freedom of expression, that removing fear. Is that right?
Yes.
And then, so I was just going to go on to say that, and going hand in hand with fear is obviously how you react to failure as well. So when things inevitably do go wrong, and in an innovative environment, things will not work, because that's part of the experimental nature of it. So I was just wondering if you got an approach around that.
I do, and I think that if you don't try anything, you don't fail at anything, but you also don't accomplish anything. So the way I look at this, there are good failures and bad failures. Bad failures are where you are sloppy, you're unprepared, you haven't thought things through, you miss steps, and you're just, sort of lackadaisical. And as a result, what you think should have happened doesn't happen. That to me is a bad failure because it could have been prevented. Mm-hmm. A good failure is where you've thought everything through, you've done everything right, but you don't get the right answer. But it's not because you were sloppy, it's just because you didn't get the right answer. And you probably did learn some things along the way. Those are good and should be encouraged because through that, you ultimately will find some things that do work. And so, separating good failures from bad failures, I've always been someone who is willing to take calculated risks. And that's really what you're talking about. What is your propensity for change, for taking risk? And it's like going to play roulette and betting black and red. You could sit there all night. You're not going to win any money. You're probably not going to lose any money. You can have a couple of drinks and you can go home. But that's not how...
You're playing the game, but you're not in the game.
Right, exactly. You're playing the game, but you're not in the game. That's a great way to explain it. So I encourage people to reach and to get out of their comfort zone and to think of, if you think of something with fresh eyes and it starts to look bold, well, of course there's some risk attached to it, right? So you try to minimize the risk by doing extensive analysis and planning and talking to lots of people and figuring out as well as you can, what the upside and downside is. And ultimately you have to make a decision as to whether you do it or not. But if you don't try doing that, I call this playing not to lose. If you're in a sports team or any sort of competitive activity, you're playing to win. Mm-hmm. You want to win the Super Bowl, you want to win a rugby match, you want to win, a car race, whatever it is. You want to win. And you don't enter this process to get second place or to be in the final four. You want to win. But a lot of companies play not to lose, which basically means playing it safe. And if you play it safe, you can sit around at the table for a while, just like the roulette guy. But then what happens is, you become a Radio Shack or a Kodak or a Blockbuster. You're not a Netflix who continually has reinvented its business model to reflect the fact that technology is changing, distribution channels are changing, people's gadgets are changing, and we need to embrace and be part of that change or we're going to become fundamentally irrelevant. And, they made mistakes, but they catch them quickly and they recover and they move on. And the market's rewarded them, fantastically. That to me is playing to win. Whereas some of the older line.
Sorry, but I was just going to say, but I mean, there's that assessment of risk is, from a private equity point of view, from my understanding of in private equity, you have. You're expecting quite a few to fail, but you need 10-15% of the companies you invest in to come good. So there is that playing the ratios aspect of it.
Just in the interest of precision. So what you describe with the proportions really relates to venture capital, where you're starting with a venture capital fund that might have 40 investments and, they need 2 Googles and the rest can blow up and they've made a fortune. So That's sort of the venture capital arena. Private equity is not that way.
Right.
So, a typical private equity firm might have 10 to 15 active investments of a much
more mature,
greater value, and they want every one of them to make money. Now, they all won't generate the same incremental returns, but they don't want any of them to blow up, partly because they've got a lot of equity invested in each company. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Good point, and I stand corrected. Now, I'm really aware that this has been a fantastic conversation. I've really enjoyed it. That we're fast running out of time, and there were a couple of things I wanted to just touch on before
Sure.
we finish. You mentioned fleetingly earlier your new meeting model. I didn't know if you got an opportunity to just quickly take us through how that works.
So the problem with meetings is that they become a free-for-all. Anybody can request a meeting. Anybody can invite people, or they can invite themselves. There's typically no advanced materials delivered. There's typically no definition of what the purpose of the meeting is and what the outcome of the meeting should be. And it's brutal. It's brutal. And it is probably the biggest time suck in an organization by far. If you ask leaders, what is the single biggest problem they have, is that I'm in meetings all day. And so I have developed a model to put some structure around this, to make sure that, so to give you an example, it's not uncommon to have 4 people from one department go to a meeting. Well, why do you need 4 people? Why can't one person go to represent the department and report back to the other 3 what happened? That in itself saves 75% of that time for those 3 people, right? And if you had materials distributed in advance, then you don't have to spend your time reading things to each other as if you don't know how to read, right? So if you read the material up front and you were told what the purpose of the meeting is, then the purpose of the meeting is to ask questions based on what you read or questions you may have, and then to move on, make a decision to move on. And so a lot of these things are very simple prescriptive tools. There's some definition about how to lead these meetings and who has to be in charge of them. But the object of the meetings model is to dramatically reduce the number of meetings, increase the decisioning coming out of meetings, and to free up an enormous amount of time for leaders where they can spend that time with their employees, with their customers, and doing things that are really constructive.
Interesting. Yeah, I relate to that completely, and I'm sure thousands of others will do too.
Exactly.
But I mean, do you think? Are we then saying that meetings ideally should be, I mean, it depends obviously how long your agenda is, but that you should be able to get through them in 15 minutes, half an hour, if it's a question of just sort of achieving decisions from the debate.
So, in this chapter in the book, I mean, there are different types of meetings. Obviously, certain meetings require more time than others, but I think the default mechanism today is, let's put an hour for the meeting.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons is that's the box in Outlook, So it's, I'll see you from 9 to 10. It would never be from 9 to 9:20. No one thinks like that, right? No one even thinks of a 30-minute meeting. So if you just cut the meeting time, that would save a lot of time.
Focus anyway.
And then you have the newer phenomenon that people call in on conference calls, and while they're on the call, they're doing their mail, and people are texting each other during the meeting, and like you're there, but you're not really present.
Yeah.
And so it's like anything else. If you focus on meetings as a problem, and you apply legitimate business techniques and solutions to meetings like you would do to launching a new product or, opening a new facility, and, and do it with that level of rigor. And what I did is just created a lot of easy shortcuts to do that. You will find an amazing, and I've already seen this many times, an amazing amount of time is freed up. Amazing. And it's not just the time. The quality and speed of your ability to make decisions is greatly accelerated.
And everyone appreciates it, presumably.
Everybody appreciates it because, part of the reason, so like a big complaint is, what's your biggest concern? I can't get to speak to my boss. Why? He's always in meetings.
Yeah.
Well, guess what? If he wasn't in meetings, you could talk to him. I mean, there's a circularity to. I mean, it's fun. I mean, it's funny, but it's not funny. I mean, when you talk about it, it's you laugh. I don't mean you personally, but it's not funny. It's like a disease.
It's because we all recognize it as well, isn't it?
Exactly.
It's endemic, and that seems to be how life works. But I think that's your reflection on us allocating an hour, because that's what Outlook has in the calendar, is so true. I should imagine that's the box ticked, and so now we're in the meeting for an hour. We've got to stay here for an hour, and there's no reason for that whatsoever. It's totally arbitrary. Brilliant.
One last thing. It's funny because I've been really, once I started writing the book, like my antennas of looking for this stuff have really been much more, much more acute. And I don't like take out a stopwatch or anything, but I've noticed that it's like for an hour meeting, normally the first 10 minutes I would describe as kibitzing. It's like, how are you doing? How was your weekend? What about the football game? Getting ready for Thanksgiving? How was your turkey? Did your son's little?
Yeah.
It's all. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with that, except it's chewing up 12 people's time, most of whom are not interested in this little conversation. Right? So even that 10 minutes times all the meetings could be an hour and a half a day.
Mm-hmm.
Just, and I'm not saying be brutal, like, okay, I'm calling the court to order, state your business, and leave. I mean, it's got to be a little
you got
social.
Humanity in there too.
Yeah, I said be humanity. It's not like a machine, but it's out of control now.
Yeah. Well, we're out of our time as well. I do have one last question, which I like to ask people, and I'm springing it slightly upon you. But what advice would you have now for your 30-year-old self or 25-year-old self setting out on a career? Is there anything spring to mind?
Well, I have a son who's 32, so it's not too far from your question. And, a lot of people say to young people, this is not going to be a short answer, but a lot of people say, trust your dream or do what you want or things of that nature. And the reality is, some people don't know what they want. Some people are in a position they're in because they got there. They're not even sure how. And to me, it's unrealistic to assume that you decide you want to do something and you can be good at it and make a lot of money and, fulfill your life's wishes. I mean, I think for those people who have been able to do that, I applaud them. But I think that's the minority. I think if you're in a position, if you're in your position, I think you really have to, think about the 5 principles in the book. And I'm not just saying this to plug the book, but I think if you look at your world clearly, if you use fresh eyes, if you connect with people, both your employees and your customers, if you're fully transparent, if you have strong values, if you adopt those kinds of principles, you will be successful. There's no doubt in my mind you will be successful, and you will, unfortunately, shine above everybody else, because unfortunately most people don't do that. And so I think you can be great at what you do in whatever it is you do. You may like it more if you're more successful, and you might be happier. And that's what I would tell people to do, to be the most effective you can be where you are, because that also gives you other opportunities. Because if you're successful, that also opens up opportunities to potentially do something else. Building on success as opposed to leaving from disappointment and lack of fulfillment. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but that's how I sort of...
Yeah, but it's all about following that curiosity, though, isn't it? So
yes.
And I'm a big champion of that too. So I think that's great. Superb. Well, thank you very much indeed. There's lots of really interesting points that you raised there that I think will be great food for thought for everyone listening. And I really appreciate it. Thank you very much indeed, Steve Goldstein.
Thank you, Roddy. I've really enjoyed spending this time with you.
As you've just heard, Steve is a very affable and entertaining guest. Before we started the recording, he was recalling a visit he'd made to Scotland, where I'm based, often stereotyped as the land of whisky and golf, though we like to think of it as one of innovation and endeavour. Steve recalled how the barman in his hotel had tempted him to sample the shelf of local brews behind the bar, and I felt that we could have happily lost ourselves in conversation for many hours had there only been a bottle of whisky lying between us, rather than the whole of the Atlantic Ocean. Anyway, so what were the big takeaways that I gained from this conversation? I think the two most striking and impactful impressions I have is that firstly, despite the enormous responsibility that comes with high senior executive roles, and I really like that Steve stressed quite how much work they involve, there is no let-up, that retaining a sense of humanity is vital, treating people as people, not units of work. This came through in two stories that Steve told us. His wonderful tale of how, while working in London, he used to have occasional drinks with the office window cleaner, who had an impartial eye on who was really working and getting things done, and who was just winging it. This is the first of Steve's 5 principles of his forthcoming book, having fresh eyes, which is all about being able to see the reality of things, rather than just the box-ticking approach. The second was his powerful example of how people need to be incentivized for behaviour, as well as results. The suggestion that bosses should mark people down for not bringing their teams with them, following their 360 reviews and the like. This approach really sets culture and will change behaviour, and I would love to hear from listeners who have experienced this kind of approach, either positively or negatively. Please do get in touch with me by email. Next week, my co-host Mark will be speaking with the entrepreneur and researcher Professor Rob Walcott, director of the Kellogg Innovation Network at Kellogg School of Management, who talks about innovating for efficiency versus innovating for growth. A really interesting conversation. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Please do hop over to our website, www.innovationecosystem.net, where you can find a link to Steve's website where you can learn more about his book, as well as download the transcript and get the show notes and other goodies. If you do enjoy these shows, we'd really appreciate if you can take a couple of moments to rate and review them on iTunes. These shows take a good bit of time and energy, and we love to get your feedback that way. I look forward to being with you again shortly.